All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Nick Foucault, Points North. We are a compliance software company, and the solution that we'll be talking about today is our Who's Where system, particularly the data aggregation function of the system, and then what can actually occur with that information once it's up in our platform. And so, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I've been with the company going on 10 years now, very much involved in the compliance space for several of our solutions, but particularly for our Who's Where platform, which is geared towards multiple location employers. And so today we'll be talking again about the payroll data aggregation and system functionality. Just a note before we start, if you are an attendee, your audio will be muted, so you will not be able to speak, but you are certainly encouraged to submit any questions or comments you may have along the way. There's a Q&A function as well as a chat function in the meeting itself, so please don't hesitate to submit any questions, and we will absolutely make time for those in the second half of the hour. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll talk now a little bit about data aggregation. The idea behind the Who's Where platform is that it's really designed first and foremost to allow for payroll data primarily, but also other types of data, to actually be aggregated into our system. So clients that have a corporate structure, so to speak, with multiple EINs or locations underneath, oftentimes those EINs or locations will have disparate payroll platforms in place for a variety of reasons, whether it's that there needs to be some autonomy amongst the locations or an inability to mandate a centralized solution. So that's where the Who's Where platform really provides value in allowing for that data, regardless of the platform that's actually in use at an individual location level, to be uploaded into our system. And that's where, during an implementation process, our team is able to work very closely with each and every individual location that comprises an organization to work with their payroll platform, create an extract, and then have that extract actually uploaded into our system. To give you just a use case behind the genesis of the solution, we worked with originally the YMCA Retirement Fund, who had different locations all around the country. And all those locations are using different platforms. There was no way to aggregate all the data that was required for them for a variety of reasons. And so that's what led to the system in its present form today, which again is geared towards taking all that individual data at a location level and aggregating it into our platform. And it goes well beyond just payroll data. Benefits data, location data, so things like addresses, EINs, demographic data, of course, for employees that are across these multiple locations. All of that information is able to be aggregated directly in our platform and then utilized for a variety of different functions. One of those primary functions is benefits eligibility calculation. So the clients that we have oftentimes have very complex rules and eligibility requirements for their various benefit plans. To give you an example, we had a client who initiated a 403B plan, and at the time of initiating that plan, they had a consultant help them devise some rules which were very, very complicated and involved the necessity to actually aggregate data from the hundreds of locations that made up this organization. And if employees were working at multiple locations and working as a certain position, there were certain requirements that went into that. If they had a break in service or they terminated employment and were rehired, there were certain windows that affected eligibility. And so they were able to basically give our team those requirements. Our team is able to program those exact requirements into our platform. So as the payroll data, in this case, was being aggregated into our solution from the individual locations, the system is actually performing the calculations to determine the eligibility of employees as they reach that status, and then also provide notification of that, not only to the corporate level users, but to the individual location users. And throughout the locations are various degrees of business and administrative experience. So an overall intent of the system is to provide a very clear notification to the individual location users as to when somebody has reached that eligibility, so that the proper steps can be taken to enroll them in a plan or receive a waiver or whatever the appropriate step might be. So programming the rules and requirements to calculate benefit eligibility statuses and then provide that eligibility notification and an organizational overview is absolutely a core function of the system. Invoicing and funds transfer is another aspect that's made possible by the aggregation of this data. So it's very common for our clients to not only want to determine eligibility for people who are going to enroll in, for example, a retirement plan, but then also put in place a method of actually receiving funds for that plan, typically into a trust account. To give an example, we work with many Catholic diocese clients all across the country. One of those clients recently has initiated a retirement plan, and they've had some issues with trying to receive manual checks from individual locations to fund that plan, and some issues with timeliness of that information. Also, their record keeper has, has stipulated that they must be receiving a consolidated file of all the contributions. They are unwilling to take a individual file or individual data from all the individual locations. It all has to get consolidated. And so the Who's Where platform is able to, first of all, configure invoices that individual location users can actually create based on stipulated deadlines directly in the Who's Where platform. We'll display the employees that had a contribution for that pay period or for that month. It'll also calculate things like an employer match if there's some criteria like that. And then a user can actually authorize that invoice to initiate an ACH funds transfer of that money from their account, which is set up in the Who's Where platform, to, in this case, a diocesan trust account. And when that funds transfer is complete for a given period of time, the Who's Where system is able to generate a file based on the specifications of the record keeper so that the organizational user can take that file and load it to that record keeper using their methodology. And so it fits very well in terms of solving that issue of not only the funds transfer, but then also the remittance to the record keeper. And so again, with that remittance process, our team is able to build to the individual record keeper specifications. And we work with a multitude of different record keepers in terms of having already built export files for their platforms. But if a new record keeper comes along and has a new specification, our team is very agile and able to adapt to whatever specification is presented and build that ability as an export out of our platform. Of course, this is only as good as the data. So making sure that all of the data is in the platform for a given period of time is very critical. And so the platform also has very, very specific tracking methods at an individual location level. For example, if there are a multitude of different pay frequencies in use across an organization, the Who's Where system is able to actually program those individual pay frequencies for each and every individual site. And what that allows the system to do is create an accurate determination of anybody that's actually late in loading their data. So somebody on a monthly pay frequency certainly would not be late as quickly as somebody on a weekly pay frequency. And so being able to accommodate, tracking across those individual locations using their actual pay data is a very, very beneficial function of the platform in order to ensure that the data from all the individual locations is being loaded in a timely way so that it can be then consolidated and transmitted to a record keeper. There are also automated follow-up tools within the platform that can be utilized if a location is behind on loading their required data into the system. Our team at Points North is also able to be engaged directly to follow up with individual locations and help them through whatever processes they might need assistance with in terms of loading their data in a consistent manner into the platform. There's also very robust reporting functionality, generic reporting functionality in the system. And so obviously all this data, is demographic data, location data, benefits data, enrollment data, all this data that's being aggregated is very useful for a variety of purposes. And so as an organization has their individual locations submitting this data into the Who's Where platform, there are a multitude of reports that can gather that information either at a true organizational level or specific to individual locations. And so reporting on employee demographics, enrollment data, payroll data, invoice data, there's really no limit to the type of reporting that can be done via the platform with all of the individual data that's being aggregated up into the system. And so what we'll do now is I'll actually move over into the live system itself, show some of these features, some of these functions, and as I'm making that transition, I just want to invite anybody who may have a question at all at this point to certainly go ahead and submit that in a typed question either via the Q&A function or the chat function, and it'll be just a moment here as I transition over into the live system. So this is a look at the live system. We'll talk about this in just a moment. I did see a question come through, however, that I'd like to address now. The question is involving, what limitations are there in terms of payroll platforms across individual locations that you may need, to consolidate. And so, from our perspective, there really are no limitations on the payroll platforms that might be in use. To give an example, we've had clients that throughout their hundreds of locations have had just multiple different levels of sophistication in terms of the platforms that are in place. And so many of those platforms very easily can produce an export file based on a specification, and that file can be uploaded into our platform. Some of those platforms can't produce just a singular file. They have to produce multiple files. Well, that's not a problem from our perspective because we're able to actually work directly with whatever file outputs a system can create and then build the ability for those to be uploaded into our system. And so in the occasion that there's a platform in place that just simply can't output anything because it's just not at that level of sophistication or it's a very manual process, there are methods of actually uploading that data or entering that data manually into Who's Where. And so we'll go through some of that visually here. Another question I saw, can you utilize the Who's Where system if you have a centralized payroll? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. We do have clients today that have centralized payroll, and they use our system for some certain functions like ACA reporting. And so with a centralized payroll, a file output can be created for all individual locations and then uploaded into our system. And so not only a centralized payroll in terms of each and every individual location, but also if there's a centralized payroll for some locations but not all, the Who's Where system can also accommodate that. And so we have some clients who have that situation where, let's say they have 100 locations and 60 of them are on a centralized payroll. The other 40 are disparate and using all sorts of different solutions. We're absolutely able to support that as well. So if any other questions arise, please feel free to submit those. But what you'll see here on the screen in front of you is what's called our executive dashboard. And just to give a little bit of insight into what you're seeing here, this is where we would set up a corporate level organization, so to speak. And then here you can see the individual locations that comprise that organization. And this, of course, is just demo data, but this would be something that during an implementation would be configured to the exact specifics of an individual organization. And so this view of the executive dashboard would only be something that's visible at the organizational or the corporate level. And what this is doing is actually providing an overview of what's happening throughout the organization for a variety of things. And so some of those functions that we talked about, payroll data consolidation, payroll uploads, the timeliness of those, funding and invoices, that's what's broken out here at an organizational level. So this participation summary table, this is what would actually be configured, again, during an implementation process to house whatever benefit plans a client is interested in tracking. We have some clients who track a multitude, like you can see here, medical, dental, retirement. We have some clients who only track medical for ACA purposes. We have some clients who only track retirement. We're really able to configure any benefit plan directly in the platform and then of course the corresponding eligibility rules for those plans as well. And so this table is providing an overview of employees that are either enrolled but not eligible for a plan based on the rules in the system, or vice versa, that are eligible but haven't been enrolled yet, and then some overviews of total numbers. This is really designed to let an organizational user not only drill down into the specifics of individual locations, but also just to have an overall view of what's happening across the organization for eligibility with their various plans. You can also see the payroll table. This is what will actually allow for the system to track at that very detailed level whether or not payroll data is being uploaded into the platform based on the deadline requirements. And so sometimes an organizational user will utilize this on their own to manage this throughout their organization. Sometimes they'll engage the Points North team to do that aspect of things for them. To give you another use case, we work with pension plans. There's a pension plan that we work with roughly 60 locations all across the country, all with different payroll platforms, all with different payroll frequencies. And the specifics of this plan actually require that data be aggregated and submitted to the record keeper on a monthly basis. And there are deadlines each and every month where all of the individual data must be present in the Who's Where platform in order for it then to be exported and sent to the record keeper. And so this plan has actually engaged the Points North team to facilitate the timeliness of those individual payroll uploads, as well as then facilitate that transfer to the record keeper of that consolidated data. And for the 3 or 4 years that we've been working with the plan now, there hasn't been even a single instance of a late transmission of that data, because the Who's Where platform is so robust in terms of the tracking for each individual location. So as we monitor this data, we're able to engage with those locations directly if they're behind on uploading anything into the system. And then finally on this page, you'll see the funding and invoices tables. This is what will actually give an overview of what's happening in terms of those invoices. And I'll actually drill down into a visual on one of those invoices. And you can see here there's a variety of benefit plans on this sample invoice of 403B, medical, dental. What this is really allowing is for an individual client to have a configurable invoice based on the funds that they're looking to have transferred through the system. And so perhaps this would just be a 403B invoice that an individual location would create, let's say, with every check that they have. And so they would go through the process of uploading their payroll data, creating this invoice and reviewing it for accuracy, and then being able to actually submit this invoice for an ACH funds transfer directly in the Who's Where platform. And of course, all the tracking mechanisms that are in place for payroll data are also in place for invoices. So the ability to set due dates, the ability to monitor who may be delinquent in their funding, that's all a function of the invoicing capabilities within the Who's Where platform. I'd also like to take a deeper look at some of the individual location items that are present here in the system. So to talk a little bit about the eligibility calculations, again, you can see here the various locations that are present in this organization. If we drill down to a location homepage, this is a view that a specific location user would have. So this would be something that, let's say, John Smith, the bookkeeper at the Duluth location, would see when he logs into the Who's Where system. And he would only have access to his individual location. And what he would be seeing here would be an overview of what's occurring at his location that may need his attention. So the first and foremost tables are dealing with eligibility. So again, the ability for the Who's Where system to calculate these eligibility determinations will then provide this view for somebody at a location to take action. So we're seeing two tables here: employees that are eligible and not enrolled, and vice versa, employees that are actually marked as enrolled and are not eligible based on the criteria of the plan. And so the system is calling forth both of those examples for somebody to take action on. And we'll drill down into that in just a moment. You can also see some tables that are dealing with invoicing, whether or not there's an invoice that needs to be authorized. Somebody has created it but hasn't actually transferred the funds. invoices that are late or upcoming. This is all designed to really give a individual location the tools they need to stay current with all the demands that are part of their role. Now, if we do drill down into an employee view, this will actually give you a sense of how this data resides in the platform. And so this will take us right to an employee's plan information page. There are two ways of interacting with this data, either manually or having it uploaded from a record keeper. And so just like an individual user could upload a payroll data file, and a user could also upload a enrollment data file to actually bring in start dates of enrollment, stop dates, waiver dates. That becomes particularly important if the system is being used for ACA, Affordable Care Act, tracking and reporting. But also on the retirement side, there's the ability to actually store that enrollment data here in the platform. So if this gentleman was eligible for enrollment, as we can see here on the 403B base plan, a user could facilitate the process of actually getting this person enrolled via the record keeper's process. And then in the Who's Where system, they can actually add a record of that enrollment to reflect what occurred. So if this person was actually enrolled on October 1st and that became official, somebody could enter that date so that the system, the Who's Where system, is now aware that that enrollment took place, and there's no longer a need for that location user to take action there. That's actually been managed, and this person would then disappear from that person's homepage. This is a process whereby, again, this information can be entered manually, or it could be uploaded directly from a record keeper to bring that into the system. But the idea behind this is that it provides the tools not only to determine who's eligible, but also then to manage their enrollment data so that nobody's getting missed when they're qualifying for a plan. And again, this can apply to any sort of benefit plan, whether it's medical, dental, retirement, pension. We even have clients who utilize this sort of thing to manage whether or not somebody has completed a background check. So it's really very configurable based on the needs and requirements of an organization. If I go back one tab to general information, I just want to show how this can be very useful in terms of storing this demographic data for an employee. And again, this will come in from the payroll file that's being uploaded. The payroll systems really are the true source of truth, or should be, in terms of this information. So if somebody is missing an address in their payroll platform, an address would then be missing for that employee when that file gets uploaded into Who's Where. And there are reporting mechanisms to drill down into critical data elements that might be missing so that an organizational user, for example, could run a report and find all the employees missing an address throughout the organization, and then perhaps issue a communication to notify those individual users that addresses should be added to the payroll systems. So that's just a simple example of how demographic data is stored and managed in the Who's Where platform. There are also configurable items. One example would be what we refer to as position. So you can see here, this is a master list of positions that can be configured at the organizational level. So if there's a need to create a consolidated list of positions that a user is forced to select from to create a cleaner set of data throughout an organization, that's another function of the system that's able to be configured during an implementation. So this would actually create a master list of positions for Who's Where purposes that each and every employee would be categorized from. I'd also like to just show you the payroll information. This is where things will get summarized by year, but if you drill down into an individual year, you can see all the individual pay records for an employee. And the deductions that are captured from the payroll systems are configurable. So if there's an organizational need to capture only a certain deduction, or to capture a handful of deductions, or to capture every deduction possible, that's something that's also designed for each client during an implementation so that we can capture into our system the exact deductions that somebody is interested in obtaining from all the disparate payroll platforms that are in use across an organization. There's also a tab to store dependent information if that's necessary, typically again for ACA purposes, and a very robust tracking and measuring tool for the ACA that actually will display the particulars of each employee. So things like their initial measurement period, then going into their standard measurement period and administrative period and then stability period. This tool is very, very robust in terms of actually measuring and tracking employees based on ACA rules and regulations. So the actual ACA and IRS requirements for tracking and measuring employees are part of the system, so that if a client is utilizing that functionality, they'll be getting determinations based on the law rather than based on an organizational rule for something like a 403B plan. So the ACA piece of the system is designed to really give the most robust possible compliance tool for not only, of course, the reporting that's required on a tax year basis, but also a year-long process of tracking and measuring employees pursuant to those rules and regulations. I'll also show some reporting functionality. We talked a little bit earlier about how there's just a variety of different reports that can be utilized to review data in the system. So to show a simple example, the employee demographics report, if I'm an organizational user, you can see here how I can choose the individual employers to select in this report. And so if there was a need to review information for, let's say, 3 of these locations, those 3 locations could very easily be selected and then used for reporting purposes. And so when I click our report button here, you'll see that this data will actually display not only here on the page, but then also is able to be exported to Excel. So back to that example about perhaps looking for people missing addresses, this fields table can be reviewed to actually find whatever field somebody's interested in reporting on, generate that report, and then review that to determine if there's gaps in data or information that needs to be reviewed at a closer level. Just a very robust reporting functionality in the platform for, again, not only demographic data, but payroll data, invoice data, enrollment data, really all the data that's present in the system and aggregated in the system is able to be reported. So with all that being said, I'd like to kind of pause here and see if there are questions that might be able to be answered regarding anything that we've covered so far today. I do see one question that's come through. It's kind of similar to the limitations on payroll question. Are there limitations on the enrollment side of things or a record keeper side? And the answer really is no. As long as there's a specification that can be provided from a record keeper for our platform, we are really able to work with any vendor in terms of not only aggregating data into the Whosware platform, but then actually consolidating it and taking it out. And so as long as those specifications are able to be communicated, again, our team is very, very adept at being able to work with those requirements and then create those individual exports for various record keepers. A couple more questions I've seen here. If we have a centralized payroll and HRIS system, can you still use Whosware for ACA reporting? The answer there is absolutely yes. If you have a centralized payroll platform, a centralized HRIS platform, you can still export that data. And again, we would work during an implementation process to create this functionality. You'll be able to export that data directly from that centralized platform and load that data into Whosware for all the individual locations. And so we do have clients that are doing that process today. So rather than each and every individual location uploading their data separately, an organizational user is exporting that data and uploading it into the platform. And so just to show an overview of what some of that looks like, this is a dashboard for the ACA side of the system. And so whether this data is coming in from all individual disparate locations or coming in from one centralized location, the system is still going to be able to perform the necessary tracking and reporting that's required based on the ACA. Another good question I saw here, what about employees that work in different locations within the diocese? So if this is a Catholic diocese example, that's a very common occurrence, and it's also common outside of the diocese, but very common inside the diocese model. So if there are employees that are shared between locations, oftentimes the administrators at those individual locations won't even sometimes be aware that that employee is shared. And so within who's where, using an example of disparate payroll, maybe location A is using paychecks and they're uploading their paychecks data file into who's where each pay period. Location B is using ADP and they're uploading their ADP file into who's where each pay period. What's happening is, let's say employee John Smith is at each of those locations. John Smith's data for location A and B are both coming into who's where. And so what that will do is if there's a benefit plan in place that says that an employee working an average of 20 hours or more per month, let's say, is eligible for a benefit plan, the who's where system will take both of those data elements for that employee and use those to calculate benefit eligibility. And then each individual location will be informed through the system that that person's become eligible and would then be able to coordinate the appropriate steps to take, oftentimes then with the diocese, because the diocese may have direction in terms of where that person should be enrolled or where they should be waived. Really what the who's where system is going to do is it's going to provide that tool to become aware of that situation and then still appropriately calculate that person's eligibility. And if there are different criteria for people working in multiple locations, that again is all able to be configured. On the ACA side of things, there are some very, very strict rules and regulations around how you need to handle employees in multiple locations. So the ACA side of the system will take that into account. But in terms of customizable eligibility, the system is very, very adept at taking those individual employees that might be shared across multiple locations, identifying those employees, and then of course determining eligibility appropriately for them. Excellent questions so far. Any additional questions on any of the functionality that we've seen here? If not, I'd like to just conclude this by again really thanking everybody for their time today. We appreciate you joining us. I actually did see one more question come in. It's involving whether or not we track matching retirement plan contributions, or is that handled by a record keeper? That's a really great question. And so the answer is we are able, meaning the system, to actually calculate things like a match. So to go back to our invoice example, if there is a match in place for something like a 403B plan, the location user is uploading the data for contributions from individual employees. And then let's say there's a 3% match on a contribution. The who's where system is able to actually calculate that match. And so what would happen is as a user creates their invoice, they would have those appropriate contributions actually being calculated, or matches being calculated based on the contributions that are coming in from the payroll systems. And so this is the point where that would actually be calculated and then ACH transferred in terms of the actual dollars. And then all of the appropriate data at that point would be included on a consolidated remittance file for an employer, or excuse me, for a record keeper. So it's a great question, and there's some individual pieces to it that really originate with the employer, then occur in who's where, and then get transferred to a record keeper. So excellent question. Another question I saw here, a payroll provider charges an extra fee, or is charging an extra fee for consolidating payroll data. Is that normal? And so there are some payroll providers that will charge for functionality like that. And so to consolidate data, especially if multiple systems are in place, can often involve a cost. And so if there are disparate payroll platforms across an organization, the process to utilize a system like who's where will typically involve just a standard file export from whatever payroll platform's in place. And so the ability to export that file and then upload it into the who's where system is not something that a payroll provider will typically bill for. So our who's where implementation is able to, again, engage our team with those individual providers across those various locations, typically without any cost, to then be able to aggregate and consolidate that data into the Who'swhere platform. But if an individual payroll provider is going to look to perform some of that functionality, oftentimes there will be a cost involved in that. And with that being said, I think that's the last question that I've seen in the queue. So again, I really want to thank everybody for their attentiveness, their engagement. The questions have been fantastic. And we are very, very happy to be able to provide webinars like these to help educate people about the solutions that exist when you're operating in an environment with payroll data that needs to be consolidated. And so the Who'swhere platform and our team at Points North, we're more than available if additional questions arise. We will be sending out this webinar as a recording afterwards to all of the attendees today. So just keep an eye out for that. Our contact information will be there as well. So if you'd like to get in touch, have a discussion, talk about any particular situations that might be in place for your organization, we would very much welcome those conversations. And again, just want to thank everybody today for joining us and hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you very much.